Hello, this is the second part of Chapter 7 of B.B. Price's book on medieval thought. The chapter itself is the dictates of philosophy in the late medieval church. The section is headed from the philosopher's point of view and is focused on the contrast between the Via Antica, the older way of the 13th century, and the Via Moderna, represented by figures such as William of Ockham and Nicholas of Cusa of the 14th century. It covers major differences concerning educational changes, texts and discourses, the shift to nominalism, differences in ontology, the nature of rational distinctions, transubstantiation, and a separation of philosophy and theology. In this section, Price focuses largely on the contrast between the work of Aquinas in the 13th century and the work of William of Ockham in the 14th. So, educational changes. After the great increase in Aristotelian texts and Arabic commentaries on them, the inadequacy of the liberal arts scheme to encompass all knowledge became even more obvious. Scholastics came to insist that there were a range of higher subjects which had to be recognized, notably philosophy, theology, law, and medicine. 13th century scholars had emphasized the formal aspects of education, but the epistemological skeptics of the 14th century insisted on the results of university training rather than procedures. The views of intellectuals, such as themselves, ought to be consulted, a view emphasized by Ockham. Texts and discourses. 13th century scholastics had been able to accept written texts as authorities, thus Aquinas' ready quotation of Aristotle. But in the 14th century, Ockham no longer accepted authority, save for statements of divine illumination. Aristotle was therefore no longer at the center of natural theology for him. Also, independent discourses, it was held, should replace the traditional commentaries on authoritative texts. The shift to nominalism. In the 13th century, realists had held that words could represent existing things, but 14th century nominalists saw language as only a convention, albeit to be used with precision, consistency, and efficiency. Differences in ontology. In the 13th century, scholastics accepted Aristotle's 10 ontological categories, but Ockham reduced these to 2, substance and quality. The other Aristotelian categories, time, relation, place, quantity, activity, passivity, position, and state, were simply names for varying conditions of bodies. In the 13th century, it had been thought that a mover needed to be identified to explain a motion, but for Ockham this was unnecessary. This is a precursor of the idea of inertia. The nature of rational distinctions. For Aquinas, the mind made distinctions between concepts based on reality, but for Ockham, these distinctions were only conceived by analogy. There were thus two distinctive ways of understanding God. Transubstantiation. Aquinas accepted the Fourth Lateran Council's doctrine of transubstantiation, that is, that Christ is actually present in the Eucharist, supporting his belief both on Scripture and on Aristotelian foundations. But Ockham noted that many alternative theories of transubstantiation were possible. A separation of philosophy and theology. In the 13th century, Albertus Magnus and Aquinas saw philosophy and theology as distinct but inseparably linked. Both could lead to the truth of Christianity and were epistemologically legitimate avenues to knowledge. Reason could affirm faith. But for Ockham and others in the 14th century, only divine illumination permitted faith and led to absolute certainty. Looked at overall significant differences between the 13th and 14th centuries in matters of thought, covered the areas of philosophy, ethics, education in the world, from learned opinions to political statements, and theology. In philosophy, the earlier emphasis on authority and on logic as a tool for analysis was destabilized. The linguistic optimism of the earlier scholastics had been built on precise expression, but such precision now came to be seen as hard to achieve. In ethics, whilst Aquinas had understood goodness to be a property of being, a creature was good insofar as it achieved the perfection demanded by its nature. By contrast, for Occam, goodness was something that was as it ought to be, according to a will exterior to it. Again, whilst Aquinas had tried to find a moderate path between the opposing views on objective and subjective standards of good and evil, as advanced by Augustine and Abelard, the basis for this moderate path had now been discarded, thus threatening renewed dissension. In education, the universities and their masters in the 13th century had maintained a reputation of being above the conflicts of the non-scholarly world. Their reputation and prestige grew, with university masters being seen as able to offer learned opinions on how to resolve disputes in the world outside academe. At the same time, however, the unity of the university's masters was becoming increasingly strained, as between the faculties of art and theology, or between mendicant and clerical masters. But in the 14th century, that unity was challenged by individual writers, advancing quite obviously political opinions on current events in the wider world. When 14th century university masters commented on political issues, they were continuing the earlier tradition of offering learned opinions, but some of these statements represented powerfully articulated intellectual threats in the form of political thought, a topic we'll return to in the next video. In theology, whilst Aquinas had believed that God's relationship with his believers, Augustine's divine contract, was based on the intelligibility of God, and hence on the access that believers had to understanding him, Occam thought that the relationship was based only on the will of God to have human beings believe in him. The 13th century enthusiasm for reason was foundering. Scholastics retreating to faith as reasoned understanding became unobtainable. Many thanks for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons, always appreciated. You're very welcome to support my channel, like, comment and share on the videos, subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos, and I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. Next week we'll talk about two late medieval political thinkers, that is Marsilius of Padua and William of Ockham. Have a good day.